I know, I didn't hit that at the beginning, and that's okay. The question we're going to take the time to look at was a very simple question, but one that posed a lot of question to myself. The question was this. It was, what is the pride of life? What does that mean? And it's taken from 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, as we begin reading there in verse 15. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." This morning, we're not just going to look at that one phrase, the pride of life. This morning, we're going to look at 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. In order for us to do that, the first thing that I really want us to be able to look at is these three terms. These three terms are the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. Well, what are they? What really are they? What do these three verses teach us about it? And the first thing that we recognize in verse 15 is that it tells us this. It says, these are things in the world. These are things of the world. Sometimes we look at the things of the world and we say how evil everything of the world is. And it's really not. It's not evil, the things of the world. And I want to make this point very clear, because when we look at these things, we have to remember where they came from. I'm not saying that man hasn't used things of the world and haven't perverted them. I'm not saying they haven't taken things which are good and have decided to make them evil. They have. Maybe even we have. But the things which were created in the world over in John chapter 1, verse 3. Over in John chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made." It's not that these things just came to be and all of a sudden are evil. These things were created by God. We know that God cannot create evil. He cannot create darkness. God didn't create something that was bad. He didn't create something that is dark. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, it tells us exactly how God saw his creation. Exactly how he viewed what he had created. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, where it says, "Then God saw everything that he had made." It's not some of the things that he had made. It's not part of the things that he made. It's not the things that he thought were good. No, everything that he had made. And what does it say? It says, "And indeed it was very good." So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. God created everything. And he created things that were very good. So then how is it that we're going to talk about lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life? And we'll get to that. Because when we look at these things which were created, we have to understand something else. We have to understand that they weren't made to endure forever. They weren't made to continue and to be going on for eternity. They were made to pass away. They were made to die. They're made so that they could no longer exist one day. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 8. Over in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 8, and we'll also read verse 11. It says, "All things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear filled with hearing." These things which are made to pass away, they can't satisfy us. They're not capable of satisfying us. But what does verse 11say? It says, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. These things that exist today and are gone tomorrow, how long are we really going to remember them? You know, I was thinking about a video that I watched of my sister and my niece. And my niece is like 18 years old. I was thinking about this video. And they were trying to name all of the presidents. They even had a little song, a little jingle that they were going through. And you know what? They still couldn't do it. Or struggled with it. If I were to ask anybody here, who's our first president, we know that, right? If I were to ask anybody here who was our 23rd president, maybe somebody might know that. We don't remember those things. We don't remember those things that have passed away, right? I think about it with a question that we might have. We go up to somebody and we say, hey, I got a question for you. And then not even 2 seconds later, what do we say? I forgot that question. Else if it's important, I'll remember it. How often do we remember it? These things that are in this life, these things that are created, they're created for us. But they're created to pass. They're created good to pass. We do the same thing if we look over in the 103rd Psalm, verse 15. We see the same idea there. 103rd Psalm, verse 15, where it says, as for man, his days are like grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourishes. His days are like grass. What happens with grass? What happens with wheat? It grows, and then it's cut. Wheat grows, cut, thrown into the threshing. The shaft is thrown into the fire. They don't exist forever. The riches of this world, we see the exact same thing. Turn over to 39th Psalm, verse 6. In the 39th Psalm, verse 6, it says, surely every man who walks about like a shadow, surely they busy themselves in vain. Ever think about our life and the busyness of our life being in vain? It's worthless. And that's exactly what the writer here is saying. They busy themselves in vain. He heaps up riches and does not know who will gather them. All these riches that we have, we live in a pretty great country. But what happens to those riches when we're gone? Do we know who's going to get them? Do we know what's going to happen to them? No, we don't. These are the things that it's talking about in 1 John chapter 2. These things that are going to pass away, but even to the point, our life is going to pass away. Our life is not created in a physical sense to endure forever. Spiritual sense, yes. But in a physical sense, no. James chapter 4 and verse 14, it teaches us exactly this. James chapter 4 and verse 14, where it says, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. You see, the point that we really see being taught here is that these things in this life, these things that are created, is that if our love is for the things that are created, then it can't be for the one who created them. That's the lesson we really see being taught here. We can't have a love for things that pass, for things that will not continue, for things that don't actually hold true value. Our love can't exist there, because then our love is in vain. Our love is worthless. How many of us want to think that as we go to bed tonight? That my love is worthless. And when our love is for God, we don't have to. Let's look back to 1 John chapter 2. Now let's look at these three things first we're going to look at is the lust of the flesh. But in order to look at this, actually, I want us to turn over to Genesis chapter 3. I apologize for that. Genesis chapter 3. And I want us to read verse 6. Genesis chapter 3, and in verse 6. It says, "So the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree desirable to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate." The very first thing that we see here. The woman looked at the tree and saw that it was good for food. Is there anything wrong with the fact that Adam and Eve, that they needed to eat? Is there anything wrong with the desire we have to eat? No, absolutely not, right? We know that God made provisions. He made ways for them to be able to eat. Go back up just a few verses. Genesis chapter 3, verse 2. It says, "And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden." There was fruit for them to eat. There was things for them to eat. Well, then what was the problem? What was the problem of Eve eating that fruit? It wasn't the fact that she ate. It was the fact of the lust of the food. The lust of the desire. Striving to fulfill this desire. Sometimes we think that the sinful word is flesh. It's not. We have desires. We have perfectly natural desires given to us by God. But see, what happens when we go outside of that? What happens when we try to fulfill those natural desires in an unnatural way? Well, then we fall into this lust. We fall into this sin. One example that I think of, and a pretty great example in my opinion, is this. Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. Let's read verses 6 through 10. It says, "Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate." This is talking about Potiphar there. It says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. And he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her." Here, one thing that we end up seeing, Potiphar's wife never fulfilled that lust desire. She never actually laid with Joseph. But yet what we also see is she still lusted after. There was still sin. There was still sin in the desire, in doing these things. Sometimes we might use the phrase, "Well, yeah, but I didn't do it." Yeah, but did we want to do it? Did we desire to do it? Did we long for it? There's the problem. Longing for something natural, but trying to do it unnaturally. That's how we see the lust of the flesh. The lust of the flesh is desiring and fulfilling. It's not just fulfilling these desires. It's the desiring of them too. And desiring to do it in an unnatural way. But the next one we're going to look at. Lust of the eye. Lust of the eye. Going back to Genesis chapter 3. we're going to look at Eve again. And we're going to use the exact same example, which I have to give credit where credit is due. I was looking for a different type of example to use and talked to my dad this week, and he said, "Why don't you use Adam and Eve?" I said, "Well, that makes sense." I just want to make sure I gave credit to my dad on that. But Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. It says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes." Well, here we find the second type of sin. Lust of the eyes. Sometimes when we refer to this, we refer to it a little bit differently. Eve saw something. She desired something. And she coveted it. That coveting is that lust of the eye. Do we ever find ourselves in this situation? Do you ever find ourselves coveting what somebody else has? Do we have to go all the way to the point of buying it or stealing it? I hope we don't do that. But do we have to go all the way to the point of obtaining it to say, okay, now I've sinned? Or do we realize that when I look at it and when I long for it, just as longing for the things of the flesh, these natural desires, do we realize that that longing, that desire is sinful? That is where the sin is committed? That's what we're taught. Once again, the sinful term isn't eyes. It's lust. It's an unlawful desire. I think about unlawful desirings, and we use this a lot when we talk about objects. When we talk about things, right? That person has a really nice truck down the road. I like that one. Logan, as we're driving to church sometimes, he'll sit there and say, "Hey, let's point out all the cool cars." So as we're driving down the road, all we'll hear is, "Cool car." Not even an idea which car he might be representing or thinking about, but cool car. You see, what happens when we get to be kind of like that? Where we're constantly looking and longing for these other things. What happens if we get to a point where maybe we're not looking for things, maybe we're longing after people? Maybe we're longing after the ideas, the thought of having something more. Maybe there's nothing specific. At work, they like to do something right now. They go around and they say, "Hey, got a question. If somebody could give you $600,000 right now, or you flip a coin and you get 40 million, which one would you do?" You know what I realize? There's a problem with either of those. Because now you're longing for something that you don't have. You're longing for something that doesn't hold any actual value. You're lusting with the eye. David did this exact thing with Bathsheba. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2. We see how he did this. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2 says, "Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold." You know, we don't just see the lust of the flesh here. While we do see that, you also see the longing for her, the desire for her. You see something that was unlawful for him to have. Talk about the lust of the eyes, but we have to realize it's us being captivated by things. Regardless of the value they may hold, regardless of what they may offer us, we find ourselves sometimes captivated by earthly, physical possessions. We find ourselves captivated by people, by our imagination, by ideas, by things that it doesn't really matter. And yet we let ourselves be caught up in that time. Well, let's get to our last question. Let's get to our last one. What about the pride of life? I said when I saw this question, I thought, oh, okay, I'll do this. And I started studying it. And I thought, oh, wow. Because to the pride of life, there's actually a lot to it. Go back to Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we see all three examples, all three things happened at one time. And the third one says this. It says, "And a tree desirable to make one wise." That's how she saw it in this tree. That's what she saw in that fruit. That it is desirable to make her wise. What Eve was tempted with was being made like God. Go back up just one verse. Satan, the serpent, talking to Eve, he says, For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Do we ever find ourselves in a situation, in a moment, when we want our status to be raised? Do we ever find ourselves wanting to be at work that go-to person that can almost do no wrong? I don't think there's anything wrong in wanting to be a responsible person. But if we want everybody to look at us like, oh, that person can't do anything wrong, there's a problem. Because what happens is that our pride has taken over. Our pride has sat there and said, you matter more than they do. No matter what thing we look at, no matter if it's the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, or pride of life, it comes back to one thing: a selfish desire for self. You care more about yourself than you do anything else. No matter which one of these we look at. Is that what we want our children to see? Is that what we want others to see? That, oh, that Jason White, man, he really cares about himself. Or does it want to be, man, that Jason White, man, he really cares about somebody else? He'll give you the shirt off his back if it means somebody else will be warm. How do we want to be seen? Do we want to be seen like the Pharisee in Luke chapter 18? Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Where it says, 2 men went to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess, and the tax collector standing afar off would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Which one do we want to be remembered as? Which one do we strive to be? Humbled or exalted? Are we that one who is so arrogant in ourselves that we boast in the things we've done? That we're proud of the things we've done? Turn over to James chapter 4. In James chapter 4, verse 16, it says, But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. But what was it that they were talking about? They're talking about what they were going to do. They said, today we're going to do this or we're going to do that. He says, your boasting is arrogance. When we look at ourselves and we're proud of ourselves and we say, look at what I've done, it's pride of our life. Don't let ourselves get caught up in vain glories like the Pharisee. Don't let ourselves get caught up in putting value in something that it doesn't actually exist. Don't get caught up in saying, look at what I've done on this earth. Look at how I'm viewed on this earth. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter. We all know that I like to end with some questions. And this morning, I want to end a little bit differently. I want to end with just a reminder. A reminder of what sins we're going to face in our life. And no matter which one we face, it will fall into these three categories. It'll fall into these three areas of what we face in our life. But there's one more thing. 1 John chapter 2. I messed up and I put 16 on the board. It's not, it's 17. 1 John chapter 2, verse 17. It says, "And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever." My question to all of us this morning is, will we abide forever? It's a simple question. I hope it's one that we can take with us. I hope it's one that we can take and dwell on. Because you know what? If that's what we're thinking on, am I going to abide forever? It's not putting my trust in myself. It's not putting my hope and my faith in the material riches of this world. It's saying, is God going to help me? Is God going to make me abide forever? Have we put our trust and our faith in Him? I hope the answer to this question is yes. I hope we have. I hope we have been baptized, but maybe we haven't. Maybe there's one here this morning who hasn't been baptized yet, and you need to do something. You need to be baptized. In order for us to abide forever, we must be baptized. If that's you, then we ask you to do something this morning, or maybe we've done that, and we find that we have fallen victim to one or two or maybe all three of these things. And we need to do something and make things right in a public manner this morning. The opportunity is now. Or maybe we need prayers. We talked about how it is that we ask questions and it doesn't show weakness. It shows strength. When we admit our wrongdoings, when we admit that we need help, it doesn't show weakness. It shows strength. Yes, we admit that we're weak. But what did Paul say? He said he boasts in what? In his weakness. Because he knows that that's where the strength of Christ is shown. When we're able to recognize that same thing, we can become stronger than beyond belief. Whatever the case may be, or whatever you need this morning, we ask you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.